In the 17 and early 1800s, people from South and North Carolina and the southern states often traveled west. Some families would group together because it was safer that way. Traveling in a group was safer than traveling alone or with a single family. At one time, a family by the name of Walters were camping on a creek bank in Kentucky. Another family by the name of Wadley camped there at the same time, although they were not in the same groups, but they camped there at the same time. And each had a young teenager. And they stayed for several days because they used to do that and rest. And the teenage girl and the teenage boy became infatuated with each other, and they kept in touch with each other. And I don't know, the years were sort of vague because Uncle Felix didn't tell me those exactly, but sometime by the time the Civil War came, they had married, the girl and the boy. And they had owned a plantation 20 miles north of Nashville, Tennessee. And they had um, four children, two boys and one girl, and and then another boy, a younger boy. The two boys were old enough to be in the army, and they had been conscripted and joined the army. But the young teenage boy wasn't old enough yet. So that left his mother and himself and 50 slaves on the plantation. And I can't tell for sure whether I've tried to find this, but the court records have been destroyed by fire. So I don't know whether they were over the Tennessee-Kentucky line or not. But anyhow, just know that the plantation was 20 miles north of Nashville. And the father decided to become a conscription man for the armies, buying horses and things that they needed. And also, the daughter had married and had three little boys. And they lived in Bowling Green, Kentucky. And her husband became a conscription man, too. So that left the grandmother, Mrs. Walters, on the plantation with her teenage boys and the 50 slaves. And the family got together and decided it would be safer if if she moved home with her kid, and helped share the work and so forth. And Uncle Felix, like Grandpa Calbert, never lost his Southern accent. And yeah, sure. Have you got your tape thing going? That's okay. And so that's what she did. She moved home with her kids, and that's why my grandfather, GF, General Forrest, he was named after a Civil War general, was born on the plantation. And the oldest son of their daughter's name was Harriet. She married Stephen Calbert. And so Harriet Calbert, oldest son, was about 10 or 12 years old, and that was Uncle Felix. And you've probably heard Rose or some of them talk about Uncle Felix because he lived here in Plainfield for a long time. And so did his son and family. And So Uncle Felix is the one who told me all these stories, and I can just still hear his Southern accent. He and Granddad never forgot they were from the South. And I know when I was in about the fourth grade and came home from school, and I said, Grandpa, we studied about Kentucky today. We studied about Louisville. And he said, What? Louisville? It's not Louisville, it's Louisville. And believe you me, we never called it Louisville. And anyhow, Uncle Felix said that after they moved home, he remembered seeing his mother and his grandmother get on a spring wagon drawn by horses, go into the little town and buy bolts of material and come home and sew for 2 and 3 weeks at a time, making clothes for the slaves. Oh, see, the Mrs. Walters, who was the matron of the plantation, had all of the responsibility because the men were gone weeks and months at a time procuring, because the only transportation was horseback, and it took a long time. And she was responsible for feeding all those 50 slaves, for doctoring them, and she sent the children to school. There was a little rural school not far from the plantation, and she sent her where her children had gone to school, and now her grandchildren were going to school, and she also sent the slave children to school. Now, we don't hear about those things in textbooks, girls. The textbooks just tell us the bad part of it, and I'm sure that's true. There was a very, very bad. Grandpa and Uncle Felix didn't really believe in slavery after they got old enough to understand it, you know. Of course, Grandpa was just a baby. He was born in 64, and the war was over in 65. So he didn't remember a lot of these things that Uncle Felix did, but Uncle Felix, being between 10 and 12, he remembered a lot. Man, he remembered going into the little town where his grandmother and mother bought bolts of material, and they got the supplies they wanted. It was a long way back to the plantation, because if you walked across two of those plantations, you'd walk several miles because they were big. And of course, the kids walked. And so they decided to rest a little while before they started home. So they sat on a bench in what we would call the town park, but it was just a shady, grassy place and happened to be right across the street from the bank. And while they were sitting there swinging their feet in the long grass, two men drove up on horseback and went in the bank. Well, they didn't think anything about it, but pretty soon they heard a terrible bang. And they didn't know what it was all about. And in an instant, out came these two men rushing, jumped on their horses, ran away. And it was Jesse James and his brother, and they'd robbed the bank. Uncle Felix and his young uncle and one of his other brothers saw that. But anyhow, after Granddad was born and before the war was over, sometime in the late 64s and early 65s, the young uncle, the young Walter's child that wasn't old enough to join the army, became 15 and got conscripted because the South conscripted them at 15. Yeah. Well, his mother worried about it because she knew that he'd be homesick and miss the old Southern cooking. And sure enough, he did. And he went to AWOL. And one day, when Uncle Felix was coming home through the woods, he heard somebody keep calling, Felix, Felix, Felix. He finally discovered it was coming from the top of a tree. So he looked up in the top of the tree, and there was his 15-year-old uncle. And the uncle said, "Go home and tell Mom I'm homesick and I'm hungry." So Uncle Felix running home as fast as he could through the woods and told his grandmother. And so she fixed a basket of food right away. And she also put a note on the basket of food. And the note said, "Do not come down out of the top of the tree until it's pitch dark. Come in the back way. I'll be waiting for you." So that's what he did. And back in those days, because there was not an organized firefighting of any kind, especially for rural areas, and slaves were scared to death of fires, oftentimes the kitchen, particularly, would have a brick partition around it. And often it was a double brick partition. And theirs was a double with about 3 feet in between. And it was used for, we would say a pantry, but they said a larder. And she kept flour and meal, larder, Larder, larder. And she kept her supplies in there. So when the son came running home, well, she already had a pallet made between the brick walls for him. And that evening, she was sitting in front of the fireplace, rocking my grandfather, General Forrest, in her arms, who was just a few months old. And the little kids were playing in front of her between she and the fireplace. And there came a terrific bang at the front door. So, with the baby in her arms, she went to the door, and the kids were hanging on her skirts. And when she got there, it was her neighbor, Captain Horn. And he said, "I came to get that boy. I know any 15-year-old boy would get homesick, and I would too. And they'd run for home. And that's just what I think this boy did. And I came to get him. And you see that tree right out there in your front yard? When I find him, that's where I'm going to hang him." Oh, no. And so my grandmother just gave him a tongue lashing. To think that he would be so cruel to a neighbor's child whose children he had played with all his life. Well, Captain Hook left without the boy. And the grandmother put GF to bed in a cradle and put the other kids to bed. And then she went to the larder and got the boy out. And she said, "Now, what you did is wrong. And I'm your mother. And I hate to do this, but I think you'd have a better chance if you went back on your own reconnaissance." Yeah. And so, with a basket of food the next morning, that's what he did. And what they did to him, Uncle Felix didn't tell me, so I'll never know, but it must not have been too bad because he came home in a few months just fine. And then in a few years, he married his childhood sweetheart and became Captain Horn's son-in-law. Oh, goodness. That's It's just almost unbelievable. I think so. But that's one of the tales that Uncle Felix told me, and that I'll just never forget it. And he also told me about his grandmother doctored the slaves because the doctors wouldn't come out in the country back in those days. And so she had home remedies in the little black case. And long after she had died, somebody in the family decided they better get in that case and see what was in there. So they did. And there were recipes for these home remedies, the medicine she made to doctor the slaves and her kids too. And um, somehow or another, GF got the remedy for cough syrup. And Grandma made it. My grandmother made it. And it worked. And in this little town where they lived, everybody soon found out that Mrs. Calbert had a cough remedy that really cured cough. And when their kids started coughing, they'd call her, and she had a funny nickname. Her nickname was Sammy. And because one of her grandkids couldn't pronounce grandma, and he called her Sammy. Mink. Mink. And Mink was Dutchy. And that's how all of the Calberts got their stupid nicknames. They wasn't a Calvert that didn't have a stupid nickname. And so this, the neighbors would call and say, Sammy, do you have any cough syrup made up? And she'd say, well, yes, I think I do, even if she didn't, because then she'd make it real fast. Then she'd say if she didn't, and she'd send one of the kids to that neighbor's with the cough syrup. And in a day, the mother would call back and say, Sammy, it sure worked. So-and-so's back in school again. And I can remember taking the cough syrup when I was a child. I remember seeing it in our medicine cabinet. And all I can remember, and what happened to the recipe, I have no idea, but all I can remember is it had rock candy and syrup and whiskey. Oh, and whiskey was the basis for most medicine back in those days. And believe you me, it did work. Because I remember taking it. And but it's too bad that I imagine Grandma Sammy memorized the recipe, and she never used the recipe. She was Pennsylvania Dutch, and cooked like mad, and never used her. I still make persimmon pudding on a recipe that I wrote down while she was making it one Thanksgiving. Oh. And instead of telling me how much butter she put in it, she said, "And butter the size of a walnut." So I still make the persimmon pudding with butter the size of a walnut. And who knows whether it's a big walnut, a little one, or a middle size, but the pudding always turns out just fine. So I didn't use the paper, did I? I wonder what I missed. I think that the Mrs. Walters, that was the matron of the plantation's name was Harriet. It was her daughter was named Harriet, and my mother's name was Harriet, and it's an old family name, and it was either that or Mary Elizabeth, which is my name. Yeah. And but mine, I was named after two people on each side of the family. I know that one was my grandmother's mother, and I think the other one was my grandfather's grandmother. Yeah. But I'm not sure about that, and I hope I find out someday before it's too late. Not that it really matters, but anyhow, well, I spent 5 months in the hospital, and during that time, I had a lot of time to walk down memory lane. Sure. And I thought about all the good times we had when we were kids. There were 7 Calbert kids of Grandpa and Grandma's. They moved to Plainfield in 1897, 100 years ago this year. Wow. And Plainfield High School was started in 1900. And my mother graduated in 1904, and then again in 1905, because during that summer, the superintendent was able to get a 4-year commission instead of a 3. And if some of those kids hadn't gone back, there wouldn't have been a senior class that year. So my mother was one of the ones that went back. And then she went to Terre Haute after that, because that was the closest college around that specialized in education. And it used to be Indiana College of Teachers College. Teachers College. And that's what it was when she went. And, but, I just am so glad that I lived and could know Uncle Felix, and he could tell me a lot of these things, that happened. And I didn't have enough sense then to ask all the questions. I've thought of a lot of them since. Yeah. When I was in the hospital, I thought of a lot of them. As I said, I had a lot of time to walk down memory lane. And I think that Granddad's and Uncle Felix's grandmother must have been something else. the matron of the plantation, because and I don't know an awful lot about him except his name was Walters, his last name. But while I was in the hospital, I thought of, you don't want this on your tape, but anyhow, I thought of what if I died? I'm 83 years old, and I'm old enough to. I'm pretty ripe, so what would Jill and the kids do without me? And then I got to thinking, maybe I've done too much for them. Maybe they need a chance to do for themselves. So I quit worrying about that. And I haven't worried about it since, and I'm not ever going to again. But but I did think a lot about my family, and I thought a lot about Grandpa's grandmother, that I think was such an outstanding personality and such must have been such an outstanding person. And I am so anxious to meet her.
Oh, yeah.
Now that may
Sure.
sound morbid to you, but I don't mean it that
No.
way. I mean it sincerely, that I am so anxious to meet her. And it's not going to bother me a bit when my hand comes. And it's it's just amazing, what happens in families, and it's too bad that people don't write it down. But who thinks of writing it down when you're young and when it happens?
Right.
I'm just so glad that Uncle Felix was as old as he was and could remember as much as he did to tell me.
Sure.
But I, my husband and I tried to find the plantation, but as I told you, the records have been burned in a courthouse fire. And so I'm not sure where it was, but I just like to just cast my eyes once on that old plantation where they lived. Because when the married daughter came home with her children, they lived there after that for a while. And tuberculosis was rampant in the South after the Civil War. And Harriet Walters Calbert, granddad and Uncle Felix's mother, got it.
Uh-huh.
And two of her boys got it, the two middle boys. And I've heard Grandpa and Uncle Felix talking, and they said the death certificate said tuberculosis, but Felix and I know that it was a broken heart because she looked out over that beautiful old plantation, and she was so heartsick about the devastation of it. The sheds, the barns, all the outbuildings were gone, and the fields had been tramped through, and the crops were, the cotton and everything was laid low. And she still took care of the slaves. And after the Civil War was over and they were free, only a few of the young ones, I think Uncle Felix said 5 or 6 of the young ones, left the plantation. The rest of them stayed. So life wasn't too bad on that plantation, and I'm sure there were others like it. And I think our textbooks are in error when they don't tell that side of it too.
Right.
And I blame the pirates that brought the slaves here in the first place for that condition. And I have to admit that America has to take their blame for what they did. We overran the Indians, and then we brought in slaves, and those were two crimes as far as I'm concerned. But still, every nation makes their mistakes, and I still love America, and I still glad I'm a Hoosier. Ryan's teenagers asked me, I think it's on that, but Ryan's teenagers asked me one day this summer when they were thinking about school's going to start pretty soon, where could they go before school started so they'd have fun. And they said, Grammy, if you could go, they all call me Grammy, and they call Jill Mama Jill. If you could go any place you wanted to go, where would you go? And I thought for a minute, and I said, well, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Hoosier. I'm a Plainfieldite for sure. I don't know where on earth you'd find people that are more pure. And they all just laughed. And I said, you don't want to go anyplace, do you? And they said, no, right here. Can you think of any questions you'd like to ask me?
Uh, yeah, the Uncle Felix. Now that is General Forrest's brother.
Uncle Felix was the oldest of four kids, and GF was the youngest.
Oh, okay.
They had two brothers in between, and those two brothers died of tuberculosis also. And when my grandfather, GF, was 13, he had gone through all the 8 grades of a little rural school.
Mhm.
And his mother and his grandmother were so upset about the devastation and everything, and the responsibility of feeding the slaves and all the things they had. And Granddad looked around and he thought, well, my mouth is just one more for him to feed. And I can't do anything yet to help, really. There wasn't much for them to do except what little gardening and what little work there was to do on the plantation. And he said, my mouth would just be one less mouth to feed. And I've read in the paper where in Noblesville, Indiana, they're starting a new mill and they will hire child labor. So he talked it over with his family, and with their consent at 13, he left the plantation and came to Indiana, came to Noblesville. That's how he happened to come here. And also at that same mill was a family by the name of Miller. Their last name was Hass, excuse me. And the father was a miller, and he didn't speak a word of English, and he had 14 kids. They didn't all live. I think 9 of them lived. Anyhow, 6 girls and 3 boys lived.
Uh-huh.
That was my grandmother Calbert's mother and father.
Okay, so she was.
And she was about maybe 11 years old at that time. Anyhow, but they had been in Indiana for several years, but she was about 11 when GF came to Noblesville and to the mill, and he was 13. And he got acquainted with her father, who couldn't speak English, and that's how they met, and that was the
And they were
Calvert
German.
family as a result of it. Well,
They were German.
yeah, yeah, they had lived in a community in Pennsylvania where called Pennsylvania Dutch,
Uh-huh.
and they didn't have any reason to learn English. They lived in a community where everybody spoke Dutch, you know. And but the children from their playmates learned English, and they taught it to their family, to their mother and dad.
Huh.
And Grandma Sami was really some cook. You've probably heard that before. But she was Pennsylvania Dutch, and she didn't ever use a recipe like I told you. And Granddad came from the South, and he liked Creole food. So, of course, she learned to cook that. And all the Calberts have always been too fat, and it's because Grandma Sami was such a good cook. And she made a sugar pie that we've none of us ever been able to do it. Okay, like I said, she didn't use recipes, and there was nothing written down about it. We've all tried. Rose tried. We've all tried to duplicate that sugar pie, and we can't. We just miss it somehow. But of course, with 7 kids, they had a lot of playmates, and then there were less than 1,000 people in Plainfield, and their playmates were as welcome as the teenagers then as the teenagers are at my house now.
Yeah.
And see, Ryan's still a teenager. He's 16, junior. And you'd think this is an orphanage sometimes. One day, somebody came to pick me up to take me someplace. There were 6 cars, a truck, a motorcycle and a bicycle in the driveway belonging to the teenagers. But their parents are not at home.
Uh-huh.
They're out making money to buy that beautiful house up the street.
Mhm.
And I think the kids are more important.
Yeah.
I think they need somebody there for them. Of course, my mother and I were born for kids. I mean, we taught school Geraldine too, you know.
Yeah.
And Aunt Nona taught 48 years.
Uh-huh.
And then I had 3 college professors on the other side of my family, so it's inevitable that I become a school teacher.
Where all did you teach at?
Right here in
Right here
Plainfield
in
for
Plainfield.
34
Is
years.
that right?
Never had to ask for a job in my life. But
Was that the high school that you taught?
I taught kindergarten primary.
Oh, that's right.
And my mother taught all 8 grades in a one-room school.
Oh,
And Aunt Nona taught first grade most of her life. She taught third, second, first.
uh-huh.
And I taught third, second, first. But anyhow, we just were geared for kids. We love kids. And that's pretty typical of the Calbert family.
Yes, all right. That's the Calbert family.
And I'm just so glad that I live here where the kids feel welcome in a little community like this. And they come in after school, even if Ryan has to work right after school. They come here anyhow because there's nobody home for them.
Yeah.
And they walk in, they open up the refrigerator and drink water. And if last night's casserole's in there and it looks good to them, they pop it in the microwave and eat it. I don't say a word.
Good thing.
I don't say a word.
They'll always remember that.
Well, I hope. And anyhow, right now it's answering their need.
Yeah.
And I just, well, when I decided to become a teacher, my mother said, "You want this one?"
Yeah.
Okay. When I was a senior in high school, I worked in the superintendent's office, and I don't mean the superintendent, the trustee.
Mhm.
We had a trustee then, not a school board. And Mr. York was the trustee. And one day he said to me, I made his reports and did his figuring and so forth. What are you going to do when you graduate from high school, Mary Elizabeth? And it was 1932. And the Depression was really in its height then.
Yeah.
And I said, well, Mr. York, I'd like to go to school and teach school like my mother did. But I don't know whether I have enough money or not. And he pulled his little gold rimmed glasses down on his nose and he said, you go to school and I'll give you a school. Well, in the heart of the Depression, and I'd been offered a job, well, I had to go to school. And so I went home and told my mother that I had decided to become a teacher. And I said, we'll have to get enough money together, some way to do it. And then you could teach with 2 years, a 2-year certificate. Geraldine could too.
Uh-huh.
And she said, don't worry about that. We'll make that all right somehow. But she said, now let me tell you something right now. You know, I'm delighted that you decided to become a teacher. But let me tell you something. They made a terrible mistake when they called us school teachers. You can't teach 215 yards from kids I'd had in school.
Wow.
Of course, I taught 34 years, but they were 6. None of them were more than 8 years old, and a lot of them were 5, and most of them were 5 and 6.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm amazed that they remembered their old first grade teacher.
That's something.
But
Because
they were just babies almost when I had them,
Yeah.
And but I'll have to admit, it really fed my ego. And I still hear from a lot of the kids I've had in school. One boy, I shouldn't say boy, he's in his 60s, came to the hospital and brought me flowers twice. And another girl whom I'd had in school, and I hadn't seen her since she graduated. She lives up in the northern part of the state, and she's a special ed teacher.
Uh-huh.
wired me flowers. And I've had telephone calls and calls from the kids. One of them took time out from her spring break to come and see me.
Yeah, that's
And
great.
that just did me more
Sure
good.
did.
You know, I
That's
felt
nice.
so good about it. And
Okay.
it's such a privilege to be able to help kids,
Mhm.
even if you just had a little bit of influence on them. If it made their life a little better, it was a privilege.
Yeah.
And I thank God for that every day.
Mhm.
And my mother felt the same way about kids and about teaching. And but I'm still working on trying to find out more about the Calbert family. A couple of summers ago, one of the children of that product that I told you about, the boy in the tree that married his girlhood sweetheart. Well, her, in spite of the difference in age, her mother was Grandpa's cousin, first cousin. Because see, her uncle was the teenage boy.
Yeah.
He was more the age of his sister's children than he was his mother's children.
Yeah.
And so they were first cousins, and that meant that her children were second cousins and on down the line. Well, 2 years ago, she and her husband and her niece and her husband came to see me to ask just what you kids are asking, because they'd never been interested in it before.
Yeah.
And they were amazed, and they couldn't. They thought they couldn't believe the story about the tree. And anyhow, they promised to come back to you. They want to come back, and I want to go down there because I'm still trying to trace down what I can, because I want to know for sure what Grandpa's grandmother's first name was. I don't,
Yeah.
and the two boys that died with TB, one was Marshall and one was Madison. Well, you can trace those names because in Grandpa's family, their first child was Frank. Frank, was it Madison?
Frank Marshall.
Marshall.
Yeah.
Okay, one of them was Marshall. One
Yeah.
was Madison. Okay, it was Frank Marshall, and my mother was next, and her name was Harriet, after the grandmother. The next one was named after Grandma's family, which was George Frederick, that was Dutch. And then the next one was Charles Madison.
Uh-huh.
So
Huh.
those names are, they use their,
Yeah.
and they never called me anything but Mary Elizabeth, never just Mary, or because that was an old Southern name. And
Yeah.
how did you get your nickname? Oh goodness! And Helen was one of the children of my mother's family, GF's child, and you've probably heard about her.
Yeah.
She died when she was 19. She graduated from high school. She was a very accomplished pianist.
Oh.
And she had learned everything anybody in Plainfield could teach her.
Mm-hmm.
So Granddad was going to send her to Indianapolis to the School of Music, but she died before she got there.
Huh.
But anyhow, she used to hold me up in front of the mirror and say, "See the pretty baby." And I couldn't say baby, I said, "See the pretty babby."
Oh.
And then it got shortened to that. Oh dear. And of course, Uncle Frank nicknamed my mother, and her nickname was Hattie.
Hattie.
And his nickname was Dink. Did you know that?
No.
His nickname was
think I
Dink.
might have heard that. I just forgot about it. I remember Hattie though.
Uh-huh.
She was a
Yeah.
sweet lady.
Well, of course, my mother, I thought she was.
Yeah.
But, well, she was, because she taught school at Fairfield, a little Quaker community south of town.
Mhm.
And there's still Quakers that she had in school.
Hmm.
And one of the nicest legacies things my mother ever did for me was to leave me the legacy of her friends in that community. I still know some of them. I still visit with them, and it's just so good, and they remember her, and that does me a lot of good. And but helping kids are just in our blood. I've had kids in school, and all those kids I've had in the 34 years. Some of them have been, well, one little boy that I had in school, whose name was Danny Hadley. And there's a million Hadleys in Hendricks County, and they're all related if you trace it back RNA. And Jill's married name is Hadley, and Sarah Beth traced her family back, the Hadleys, back to Charlemagne. Wow. She's gung ho genealogy too. And but just to love kids and to have the privilege of helping them, even if you can't see what you've done. If you let them cry on your shoulder or patted them on the back or something, it was worth it. And Mom and Aunt Nona and Geraldine and I all felt that way, about it. But we were on nicknames, and Uncle Fred was next. And of course, his name was Frederick, but they called him Fred or Doey. Doey. I don't know why the Doey, except probably came from something he ate. And then Uncle Todd was next. His name was Charles, but his nickname was Todd. Okay. Aunt Nona was next. Her name was Nona, and her nickname was Known. Aunt Helen was next. No, Aunt Helen was before Aunt Nona, but it doesn't matter. Anyhow, I nicknamed her. She didn't have a nickname. Her name was Helen, but it was odd. She nicknamed me as a baby, and I nicknamed her, but I couldn't say Helen. I said Holly. And so her nickname was Holly. And then the youngest child in the family, Hilden. His name was Hilden Robert, but his nickname was Boots. Yes. And the reason his nickname was Boots is because when he was a little boy, he used to sit on the front steps and watch the people go by. They lived on the street where the interurban station people, it was on Buchanan, but the people that went downtown and that went down their street, Vine Street, and he would sit there on the step and watch the people, and as I did too. And one of the people, he could always tell when somebody was dead because we had a man in town by the name of Mendenhall, and he was a grave digger. And back in those days, they dug the graves by hand. And the men who dug the graves wore big rubber hip boots. Yeah. And Boots was fascinated with Mr. Mendenhall's boots. And so he said, I know somebody died because the boots went down the street. So that's how he got his name, Boots. Boy. And I know there were a lot of nicknames in my mom. Oh yeah, they sure did. And Rose's nickname was Dogie. Dogie. I hadn't heard that. Hadn't you? No. Yeah, Dogie. Uncle Frank nicknamed her that. I don't know why. Evelyn's nickname was Ebby. Yeah. Rollins' nickname was Mink. Geraldine's nickname was Toots. Yeah. Eugene's nickname was Jeaner. And Vicky, and Abby. And Abby, yeah. I always called her Bi, too. Well, I called Abby Bi sometimes. Yes, they did. I know how Vicky got her nickname. When she was a baby, we lived by Uncle Frank, and I was not quite old enough to go to school. I must have been 4.5, 5 years old. Anyhow, when she was born, he always baby talked to her. And he said, "This is my Icky Vicky Bay."
Yeah, I thought,
And that's how Vicky got her nickname. Vicky. This is my Icky Vicky Bay.
how was Aunt Teal related to the family?
Aunt Teal was Aunt Uni's sister,
Okay.
and she was one of my mother's very best friends.
Hmm.
Mhm.
I always liked to go to her house because she always had candy in the candy bowl. And one time she gave me, I used to carry a little purse and she gave me, I think, a penny or something to put in it. I thought that was wonderful.
Oh,
She
sure.
also did that. And her Jenny, that her sister Jenny,
Yeah.
that lived with her. In
Yeah.
fact, she lived with us for a short while. And all the time, her name,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
and my mom took care of her.
Well, I remember Jenny well.
Mhm.
And of course Aunt Uni too. Aunt Eunice was Uni.
Yeah. No, that was,
And Genevieve was Jenny. I mean, it was
yeah.
really Genevieve.
Okay. I thought it was Ginevra.
Well, now, it
Was
could
it?
have been. I could be
Okay.
wrong about that.
Okay.
But anyhow, I remember she was rather, well, she wasn't real young when she got married. Neither Artelia, and her name was Teal. Neither one of them were young when they married. But Jenny married a Civil War veteran for the name of David Holderman.
Yeah.
And they lived on Mill Street. I can show you the house they lived in on Mill Street. And I think he had been married formally and had a child, but they never had any children. But and um, he was definitely a gentleman. I can remember that, and I can remember him being in parades for the Civil War.
Yeah.
Men were put on a wagon and paraded down the street,
Yeah.
and then Jenny lived in the little house on the back of Grandma and Grandpa's lot. And that little house, when Grandma and Grandpa bought that lot, it must have been around 1905 when they bought the lot.
Hmm.
They lived in 3 houses in Plainfield, that's all. And when they bought the lot, that house was up front on the lot. And that's not the house Grandpa wanted, so he moved it to the back of the lot and built his house then.
Yeah.
And there was a big yard. He built his house on the south edge of the lot, and that made a big yard for both houses. And his kids were young, teenagers. Well, Frank was a teenager at least, and Mom. But nobody lived in the little white house. And so the boys took it over and they had a club. It was their clubhouse. They had a club called the Gimbal Club. The Gimbal Club. And then when they were not teenagers anymore, most of them. Of course, Grandma's family was strung out through a lot of years. Uncle Frank was the oldest, Uncle Bruce was the youngest, and Uncle Frank must have been born in about 1882, and my mother was born in 1884. She was the next one, and Boots wasn't born until 1901 or two, something like that. So there was a long range in between there. Well, that happened back in those days, I guess. Grandma thought she had her family, and then lo and behold, she had 3 more.
Yeah.
And that's the way it happens. But
My grandmother Eunice died when I was fairly young, so I never knew her very well. Always wished I had known her.
oh well, I wish you had
I
too.
wish I had known more about her.
I remember her father.
Uh-huh.
I remember him very well. Moses Tomlins.
Yes.
And his
Yeah.
nickname was Mose.
Mose.
And he drove a huge, big bicycle. Well, it was a tricycle, really. Had 2 little wheels on the back and one great, big, huge wheel at the front.
Yeah.
And he rode that thing when he was an old man from Plainfield to Granville to be in parade.
Is that right? Yes, my goodness.
And he was a photographer. and he was an excellent photographer. He was the first photographer Plainfield ever had. And downtown in Plainfield, on Main Street, I'm trying to think, you know where the Masonic building is in Plainfield? On the corner,
Yeah, I think
on the corner of Main and
Yeah.
the Center,
Yeah.
South Center.
Yeah.
Okay, come across the street, straight across, there's a drugstore. It
Right.
used to be, now it's Christ Corner. Go
Oh, yes. Okay.
Okay, then at the end of that block is a 3-story brick building, and that was built by the Tomlinsons.
Let's see.
Moses' father, I think. But anyhow, somebody in the town, and he had a photography shop in there. And I can, someplace I've got pictures that were taken there.
Is that right?
And he was an excellent photographer. And I can see him yet on that bicycle with his camera and a black cloth over it on one shoulder and his beard blowing. He had a long hair and always wore a hat. And they lived on Main Street where, and you know where Mooney's Free service station used to be?
Oh, I'm not sure.
Well, you know where the Quaker Church is? Okay, the Quaker Church is on the corner of Main and Southeast. And the service station was on the corner of Main and Southeast, just south of the.
Oh, okay.
But the church sits way back up on the hill. Okay. Well, when Tomlinsons lived here, when they were citizens of this town, they had a house there.
I see.
And then later it became a milliner shop. And I can remember as a little girl, probably the first woman that had her own business in Plainfield was the milliner. And I can remember standing looking in those windows and seeing the beautiful hats and things that she made. And she had married a Hadley and they had a child. My mother had him in school. And he was married and he had a child and he's now Dr. Hadley at Plainfield. But Mose Tomlinson was a figure. And do you realize that the Tomlinsons are one of the first Quakers in this community? Is that right? They're the first settlers settled on between Plainfield and Mooresville on the creek bank. It's not the creek bank anymore. This creek has receded. It used to be much wider than it is now. But there's a stone on a farm there that tells about the first settlement of Guilford Township. And Robert Tomlinson was one of the first settlers. And he also lived in the little Fairfield community, which was east of that stone, several miles. But he lived there, and they had a lot to do with the settlement of Plainfield.
Now, how is he related to Moses?
That I really couldn't tell you, but I do know that the Tomlinson building, that 3-story, was the first 3-story building in Plainfield, and it was built by the Tomlinsons. And then I told you where they lived, where Mose lived. Well, his parents lived when he was younger on the corner of Fremont and South Vine Street, cat a corner across from the Calbert.
Oh, okay.
They were like on the south. Here's the street. Grandpa's house was here, and Tomlinson's house was here. There was a street.
Yeah.
Doing like that. And
do you know their names?
What?
Do you know their names? What it was?
No, I just know Moses, and I don't know his wife's first name, but we always.
Martha, I think it was.
Martha
Jane.
That's
right. That's where Martha got hers.
I'll bet it was. I'll bet it was. But, and of course, Jenny never had any children, and Teal never had any children. They had a son Gurney, and I'm sure that wasn't his real name, but that's all I remember. And then they had another son that married a girl by the name of Mona. You surely have heard of Mona.
Yeah.
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 Well, and they had children. I've met Mona's grandchildren, played with them when I was a kid.
Huh.
And of course, Ebby and Rose and I always played together. And when we lived on Wabash, where they lived for so long, forever, Uncle Frank built that house himself.
Yeah.
And I don't think they ever lived anyplace but in that house. After they moved out of the weaning pen, I started to tell you the house that was the Gimbal Club, after Grandpa's kids got too old for clubs, teenage clubs, why, when one of as they got married, their wedding present was rent free in the little house as long as they needed it. Of course, when they started having kids, then they had to find a bigger house. But and it was called the weaning pen, and we still call it the weaning pen. So the weaning pen is still on the back of the Calbert lot. But the house, the people that bought it after when Aunt Nona sold it, it burned, and they have an apartment building there now.
Oh.
Some kind of a living complex.
Yeah.
But I hate to go past that corner, so I really can't tell you too much about it because it holds too many memories for me.
Sure.
But I can see the house, and I can even draw the floor plan of the house. And I can see all the outside of it, and the front of it was on Vine Street, on Vine Street, of course, 305 South Vine. But the house was narrow, not too narrow, but anyhow, it was longer than it was wide.
Yeah.
And about in the middle of it was a door that came out on Fremont Street with a sidewalk out to it. And then the weaning pen was back here behind that. And there were lilac bushes. There was a walk that went around it. There were lilac bushes, and then down the walk that went to Fremont Street were peony bushes.
Oh.
And I can remember both those. I've got pictures of taken in the yard.
Yeah.
And I know Uncle Frank and Mother, and Uncle Fred, when he was first married, all lived in the weaning pen. I don't think Todd ever did. And I know Boots didn't, but out of those 7 kids, one died, one never got married, and so that just left 5 to have kids. But anyhow, but at one time there were 36 Calberts right here in Plainfield. Is that right? 36 of us. Grandma could say, "Let's have a family dinner," and we go to the telephone, the old one that you rang the bell on the wall, and 36 people would show up for dinner. That included their in-laws, the one that they married, and their grandchildren. And there were 11 cousins, and we were raised just like brothers and sisters. And I can remember when we lived by Uncle Frank on Wabash, first house south, still there. Debbie and I had heard, or we read someplace where mud packs would make you beautiful. So they had a sand pile. So guess what we did? We carried buckets of water to the sand pile. We made mud packs, and that south yard slanted down to a driveway, and we laid on that slant till the sun dried them. We got up, and they came off in big chunks. But we'd break them up and have a sand pile again. And I can remember during those years that Rose had a little stove, and I don't know if it belonged in a dollhouse or what, but anyhow, there was a neighbor girl named Josephine Welker, and she and Rose played together, as all we kids did, in the back end of the churchyard, because the churchyard came to those houses, right to their backyards. And Josephine and Rose took apples off the apple tree and cut them up and cooked them on that little stove and made applesauce, and we kids ate them.
Oh my goodness. That's so
I
funny.
can remember that just as well.
Oh God.
And I can remember the piano that Uncle Frank had in the parlor.
Yes. Well. Huh.
And when Grandma and Grandpa had a parlor too, when they first built their house. You had a living room. Of course, you had a big kitchen if you had a big family. You had a dining room, you had a living room, and they had a parlor and a front porch. And then the bedrooms, except one, were upstairs. And on weekends, there were no television then and the things that kids do now.
Yeah.
But on weekends, all the Calbert kids played an instrument of some kind or sang one or the other. Even Grandpa played what they called a juice harp.
Yeah.
And Grandpa Sammy played the piano. Helen played the piano. Frank played the bass violin. I can remember seeing that in his little room on Wabash.
Oh goodness.
And with a big baby grand piano. That's all you could get in that room. There was a little room and a stairway in there.
I remember that.
Yeah, and Uncle Fred played the tuba. My mother had a beautiful voice, alto. I wish I could sing like her. I sang with her a lot of times. I wish I had $5 for every funeral she ever sang. Hell, I would not have to worry again. And Boots played the saxophone, and Helen the piano, and Mom and Nona sang, and Todd. Well, Todd also played the drums.
Yeah.
And when radio first came out, the boys had a quartet, and they sang on the radio advertising the Quaker Oil Company. And of course, Granddad, he started that Quaker Oil Company, and he named it Quaker Oil Company because of the Quakers in this community.
Yeah.
And then after he was 65 years old, he decided that he was old enough to retire. The boys could take over the oil business, so they did.
Yeah.
And he knew that he came from a family of not long lives, and so he decided he wanted to see the West Coast before he died. So, and he owned lots of cars, but he never drove but once in his life, and he had a little accident at the top of a hill going back to Noblesville, and didn't amount to anything, but that cooked GF. He didn't ever want to drive again. So he hired somebody in the family to chauffeur him wherever he wanted to go. And so when he decided to go to the West Coast, why Uncle Boots and Raymond Calbert, his nephew, chauffeured him to the West Coast. And on the way, of course, that was back in the 20s. And on the way, he saw lots of tourist cabins, and some of them had pools. The farther you got toward California, you could find that. And he came back to Plainfield in 1929, right in the heart of the Depression. And he decided Indiana needed something like that. So he built a service station, a lunchroom, a swimming pool, tourist cabins for his grandkids to run.
Wow.
And him. And we ran it. And he was there every day. He put in just as many hours as we did. He taught us things that we never in the world could have learned in a textbook.
Yeah.
Gina was the first lifeguard.
Huh.
My brother was next, Bud, and Jerry was next. I worked the baskets. Ethelene worked the baskets. Mom ran the lunchroom, and GF ran the service station, and whoever else he hired. Because he sat around and smoked cigars most of the time and told you how to do it, but not in an unkind way. In a very definite way, but not in an unkind way. I wish every kid could have a grandfather like I had. He taught us integrity. He taught us honesty. He taught us politeness. He taught us caring for other people. We ran that complex, that tourist cabin, swimming pool. lunchroom, and service.
And that was here in Plainfield.
Oh, yeah. Ron's TV shop is just over the West Bridge down here.
Yeah, I
Down the
know
hill.
that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And he built it in 29, right in the heart of the Depression. We ran it 10 years. We never lost a penny. We made money every year we ran it. After he died, Uncle Fred ran it for a while. Then he sold it to the Optimists, and they let it go downhill. But if GF had been here, it wouldn't have gone down here. I can see him yet with a cigar in his mouth, that old straw hat on, and of course he was big. You remember that seeing picture. And of course that was Grandma's fault because she cooked the food. And he was never sick until he died. Never remember him being sick until he. And then all he said was, and Nona would say, "Dad, what are you hurt? How do you feel about?" I'm just tired. I'm just tired. And that's all the complaint he ever made. I'm just tired. It was his heart. And he had just what I had. And they didn't know enough to do about it.
What was that?
He had, I had an open heart surgery.
Oh,
I had a valve in the aorta replaced.
oh,
Well, that runs in the family.
okay.
But they didn't know about it then. But I can remember my mother telling when Helen was sick. I remember her. I was probably 3 years old when she died, close to that. And I can remember she coughed. And Grandma thought it was a cold, of course. Everybody thought it was a cold, but Granddad said, "That's not just a cold. She coughed just like my mother did, and she had TB." And so there had been a young doctor moved to Plainfield, and of course, you didn't go to a doctor unless your kids were dead back in those days, you know. And so a young doctor moved to Plainfield called Dr. Stafford, and so they called Dr. Stafford, and he came several times to see Helen. And finally, Grandma said to him, "GF thinks she might have TB." And he examined her lungs, and he looked up at Grandma, saw me, and he said, "Mrs. Calbert, her lungs are Mother Calbert, her lungs are just as clear as yours and mine." Well, Helen kept coughing. And Granddad and Mom had gone. Of course, Mom was a young woman then teaching school. She'd gone to a doctor, an old doctor here in town, Dr. Thomas, who is distantly related to the Tomlinsons.
Okay.
And anyhow, Mom didn't change to the young doctor, and he said, "Take Helen to your doctor and see what he says." So Mom took her. And then on the streets in a big city, and he was walking down the street thinking, "What has happened to me? I used to have a home, a family, a job, and here I am." Husband that was a doctor. And he was an excellent doctor. He brought me into the world. He brought Jill into the world. He was an excellent doctor and such a nice person, such a nice man. Well, we've had some real good people in Plainfield, and I'm not just saying that because I've lived here all my life. I know enough about the towns around and other towns that I've read about and so forth. This is an unusual community. And our school system even though Indiana is not up with the national average, our school system is above the national average. It's above the state average. It's above the average of the elite around Indianapolis. So if anybody wants to move to Plainfield, I'm the gal who would recommend it. Not because I taught here for 34 years, but they're still good. But now you may not want this on that. If you don't, you can take it.
No, we do.
With Ryan's friends that come here all the time, I'm really concerned about them because their parents are gone. They're never there for them when they need them. And this fall, I noticed a lot of kids running around the streets. I knew they were teenagers. I knew it was school time, and I thought, what is going on?
Yeah.
Plainfield never had that many. Of course, we've got a lot more families in Plainfield now. But I know the superintendent very well, and I called him. I said, Jerry, what is going on? And he said, well, Elizabeth, I'll tell you. We're trying to do something about it. We need a special education teacher that can meet the needs of all age children, especially junior and senior high school. We have to have a room for it because if we put them back in their own classrooms, they disturb the classrooms and make the environment too hard for other kids to learn. So if they cut up in school and make an environment like that, we suspend them for a few days. Then when they come back, if they do the same thing, which they often do, we expel them for a semester. I said, Jerry, that's just what they want. They're out on the street. Their parents are gone. They're footloose and fancy free. That's just, he said, I know it. I know it. That's why we're trying to do something more about it. And hopefully we'll get it done. But I worried about it. I prayed about it. And I even dreamed about it. And I thought, that's not helping these kids right now. Somebody's got to do something to help them right now. And I'm only trained for kindergarten and primary, not high school kids. But believe me, I've learned from the having the grandchildren. And so I thought, our church has a support group for everybody you can think of. People who have lost loved ones, divorced couples, single parents, you name it, they have it. And so I called my minister and I said, look, I see these teenage kids on the street, and the responsibility of the world is going to be on their shoulders in a few years, and they're not going to be prepared. What can we do about it? We've got to do something. He said, well, I don't know, Elizabeth. He said, I'm aware of it, but I don't know what to do. And I said, Stevie, we need a support group for teenage school dropouts. Yeah. So he's working on it. They called all the youth ministers in town, which are several now, and they're working on it. And in my dream, when I dreamed about it, I dreamed about a young man that was raised in Plainfield when my brother and I were kids. Well, when Jill was, my brothers had kids, and this boy lived in their neighborhood. He broke out window lights. He did everything that kids aren't supposed to do. And but before he graduated from high school, his dad had kind of gotten on it. And he sent him to Milligan College, which is a Christian college. And as soon as he graduated from college, he was a great athlete. He became a professional coach. His name is Sonny Harris, Del Harris. You may have heard of him. Well, he was raised here in Plainfield, went to school here in Plainfield, was Jill's Sunday school teacher for a long time. And my dream said, Dell's going to come home, Sonny's going to come home and retire in Plainfield. And so the next Sunday at church, I asked Ed, and he said, well, I doubt if he ever comes back to Plainfield. What's on your mind? So then I told him about my dream. My dream was that Sonny did come back to Plainfield, retired here, and he took over the leadership of this group of kids that need,
Yeah.
because he wouldn't be paid by a church or a school. He'd be retired. They don't know him personally like I do. They don't know what church he belonged to,
Uh-huh.
and these kids are from all denominations if their parents ever went to church.
Right.
And you mentioned churchdom, they're going to run the other way.
Yeah.
So I suggest that they have a picnic in the park or a hayride or something. And a leader that will not be shocked by what these kids say, and a leader that the kids will look up to.
Yeah.
Well, who more than Sonny Harris would the kids look up to? A good athlete, born and raised here in Plainfield, and a professional coach all these years. And Sonny's worked with kids. He wouldn't be shocked at anything they said, I'm sure. And if he was, he'd have enough sense to cover it up. But I'm still working on it.
Well,
And so are the ministers. And it may not ever happen in my lifetime. But if it happens and they save just one kid, it'll be worth it.
yeah. Yeah.
So maybe I can reach up from the grave and help that kid. But it does consider, we were raised so differently when I was a kid. Parents were home for us. My mother taught school after she was married, but school teachers and kids' hours coincide pretty well. And I never felt neglected or that there was no one there for me, because there was. And but now mothers have to work till 5:30, 6 o'clock sometimes. And it's a different thing. And the kids can't help it. The kids make I think, a lot more mistakes than we did when I was a kid. The worst thing I can think of that the boys ever did when I was a kid is smoke corn silks. Not cigarettes, but corn silks. They got those corn silks that grow in a ear of corn.
Yeah.
Wrapped them in the shucks. Oh, they got sick from it, but they did it. And now they don't bother to do that. They buy cigarettes and smoke them.
Yeah.
And I think somebody needs to do something for these kids, and especially teenage kids. And of course, it starts before they're teenagers. It starts down when they're little. But yeah, I'm so glad my mother told me that I was a children teacher and not an old brick building teacher. And she also told me that it's a teacher's duty, and especially a teacher of little children, because you become their second mother. It's your duty to help that child want to do what is right.
Yeah.
And for the other kids to look up to the kid who does what is right. And I tried to do that because, and kids remind me of it now. They'll say, you remember? I can remember having two little boys in school that lived close together in Plainfield. And they were little hellions in their neighborhood. Their dads had spanked them, and it hadn't done any good. And they were both in my room at the same time, first grade. And if I wasn't the playground teacher, I'd tell them what they'd do out on the playground if they thought they could get by with it with some other teacher. So one day I was standing in the hall talking to Mr. Lyons, the principal, and one of the teachers came in with these two kids, and they said, "Guess what Stevie and Jerry did today?" And I said, "Oh, I don't know." And I had taken all privileges away from them. I'd made them clean erasers and taken recess away from them and things like that, and all the bad things they had done. And Mr. Lyons stand there with his hands crossed, and he said, "What are you going to do now, Mrs. Burns?" I said, "Well, I don't know. I've done everything I know to do, and I guess I'll have to resort to the ping pong paddle." That's what we used. And by that time, you had to have a witness if you spanked a kid. Now you don't dare touch them.
Yeah.
Right. And or say anything to them, even derogatory. But anyhow, they wouldn't have me back at school. I'd straighten those kids out. But I think they'd still like me when I got through.
I bet they would.
But anyhow, he said, "I will get the ping pong paddle for you." I thought, what am I doing? I don't want to spank these kids. It won't do a bit of good. Their dads have spanked them, and they still do the same thing. What am I going to do? And I knew I had to do something because he was going to witness, and he was going to be right there, standing right there. So I had a big oak library table in my room, like we used to have back in those days, not plastic, but oak. And so I leaned both of them over the table, and I whacked one on the seat, just tapped him, and then I hit the leg of that table as hard as I could. And then I did the same thing to the other kid. And each thought the other was being killed. And I had peace out of them for at least 6 weeks. When Mr. Lyon cracked up, he had to walk down the hall. He was laughing so hard he couldn't stay. I bet I can count on two hands the number of kids I spanked in the 34 years I taught school. I didn't think that was the way to do it. I didn't think that they'd had spankings from their parents at home and it hadn't done any good. And I had to make them want to do the right thing. And spanking them was not the way to do it.
Yeah.
Not that would be making them do it out of fear. And I did not want that. I wanted them to do it because in their hearts they wanted to do what was right.
Right.
And I'm so glad I had the mother I did. Yeah. Because when I went to school, to college, I learned some of the same things that she had taught me. But you know, there are a lot of blessings that came out of that old depression. I told you that I graduated right in the heart of the Depression. I didn't have enough money to go to school, but we got it. And thanks to Aunt Nona a lot, but she helped. She was teaching school and she helped. And then I paid her back. But anyhow, I thought, where am I going to go to school? Well, Danville had a college called Central Normal. And one of the boys in my class was going to go. Of course, if the kids had any money, they went to college out of my class in 1932 because they couldn't get jobs. So if they had any money, they went to school, which was the thing to do. And he said, "You can ride with me." Well, I got to thinking about it, and I thought, what if my classes don't coincide with Joe's classes? I don't have any money to take it over again or take myself over there. And of course, we didn't have a car. And so I got thinking about it, and I thought, well, that was nice of Joe, and I'd have to pay him. And I knew it wouldn't cost me very much, but I thought, I just can't do that because that's too risky. So I better look around and see where else I can go to school. Well, Indianapolis had a school called Madam Blaker's. I doubt a few girls have ever heard of it. Well, Toots went there, and Aunt Nona went there. And Madame Blaker was a lady who had had a finishing school in Europe.
Mhm.
And she came to America and she looked around and she thought, these American girls are not interested in a finishing school. They don't care if they're introduced at court or not.
Yeah.
Of course, in finishing school, you taught them manners and how to be introduced at court among royalty. And she got to thinking, she thought, these girls are looking to professions. And the typical profession for a young girl out of high school is being a school teacher, and especially a school teacher of young children. Because back in those days, very few young children had been any farther than the grocery store, Sunday school, and the kids next door. And they cried when they got away from mama. So she thought, first I got to teach them to be second mother. And then the academics, of course. And so she started a school here in Indianapolis at 23rd and Alabama Street. I can see the old brick building yet. And she taught us to be second mothers, first of all, to love the kids, to see the good in them, and to go from there, you know. And that's just what my mom had told me. That'd help make them want to do what they should do. And so that she didn't forget the academics, believe you me. We had those right down the line. And the teachers that she chose to help her in that school were people just like her. And then she also didn't forget that she'd had a finishing school in Europe. And you never crossed your legs knee over knee, only ankle over ankle if you had to cross them at all. And you were never seen out on the street or any place, no matter what time of the year, without a hat, purse, and gloves. And you never chewed gum. That was rude. And you didn't wear too much makeup because that was not nice either. And I never had to do it, but I've seen girls have to wash their makeup off right in front of everybody in that school. We had chapel every day because that's where attendance was taken. And believe you me, you better be there. And so if you had too much makeup on, you got to wash it off in front of everybody. And then we had old steam radiators in the rooms, and she kept a towel and a washcloth in her desk drawer and a wash pan of water on the radiator to keep it warm, and a bar of soap. And believe you me, if you had too much on, you got to wash it off. I never had to do it, but I've seen some girls who did. Not very many, but few. But that's a blessing of the Depression because see, I was forced to go to that school because I couldn't live on campus. That was too expensive. I had to go someplace where I could commute. And it was really a blessing because she taught us so many things that you couldn't learn out of textbooks and so many things that worked with children. She knew kids inside and out. And I wouldn't take anything for the experience I had in that school. It was really a blessing. And I can think of a lot of blessings of the Depression too. And some things that were not so good, and some things my family criticized me for, but I still do. Back in those days, you couldn't just live a day at a time. You had to look to the next day and the next. What are you going to do? Well, I still do that way. And Brian says, "So what, Grammy? Solve it when it gets here." And he's that way about history. And of course, Sarah Beth and I are both just gung ho about history. And he's a boy. He can care less, and he'll say, "Grammy, what do I care? I wasn't there. I couldn't help what they did." Not with Sarah Beth. She loves it. She loves it. And I talked to her on the phone the other day, and she's in Arizona. She went to Franklin College last year because she's double majoring in journalism and political science. And she thought, if I'm going to criticize the politicians and the people in government, I got to know what they're doing. So I'll take political science. So she took, that was her major, the double major. And the boyfriend moved to Arizona, his whole family, and he has a younger sister. And the mother wanted her to come live with them and go to Arizona State, which she did. But Jill and I, neither one really wanted that. But of course, Mrs. McDowell wanted it for several reasons, and one of them it was a built-in babysitter. Yeah, and so they promised her room and board free if she would help, and so that's what she's doing, and plus working a job, plus going to school. Busy. But yeah, she is busy, but she's homesick too. Is she? And you know, there comes a time in a kid's life when you have to let go. And she's 19, and it was time that we had to let go. And Jill and I both felt that it was not right. It was a mistake. But like I said, they have to make some decisions for themselves. Right. And we couldn't see anything morally bad about it, or so we allowed it and didn't fuss about her about it. But now she's so homesick, she can't wait to get home. She's coming home the 19th of December, and they've already accepted her back at Franklin. And, but like I said to her on the phone, honey, we all make mistakes. And that's how we learn. And I said, usually when we make mistakes, we're stronger and we're wiser for it when it's over. And when she talked to me on the phone the other night, she says, Grammy, I don't know that I'm stronger, but I'm sure wiser. But she just, she's the apple of my eye. I love them both, of course. Yeah. I just have the two grandchildren. But he is a boy and so different. And Sarah's like me. I mean, my friends can see that. They tell me all the time, she's just like you. That you mean she blabs all the time? That's one of the curses of being a school teacher. You learn to blab all the time, just like I'm doing now. So, it's all right. But we'll be so glad to have her, Grammy especially. Well, Jill will be too, but I especially will because. But she's going to finish the political science and also get a teacher's license to education because she's going to go to teach school so she can send herself to law school. Oh, okay. And then she'll better understand the politicians. Sure. She's learned that at school. So. Wow. And she, the words drip off of her pen just like they do out of my mouth. I said she's like, that's how we're like. I blab and she writes. Oh dear. You kids have never met her, have you? No. Well, I hope you will. She was just enthralled about the reunion. And when she was in high school, that's a picture of editor of the paper. High school paper. That's a pretty name too, Sarah Bill. She's named after two grandmothers. Grandmother Hadley is a Sarah, and Grandmother Burns was the Elizabeth. Yeah. Pretty cool. There's another picture. I think it's the same picture, but she she just writes like nobody's business.
Hmm.
One day, um, I've got everything in here you can think of. Says Calbert family. It's Calbert, Raper, and Burner. And Hadley family, to tell you the truth. She was interviewed by some college man that was sent to this neighborhood to interview. I think I'll just where that is now. To interview people, and her picture was in the paper, and she was quoted then in the Wall Street Journal. Wow.
Really?
But she is gung ho, and she tries to do it in a polite way, but she never hesitates to do what she thinks.
Yeah.
And of course, I know that she will not always be right, but they have to express themselves, and I try to be patient about that. It's a little hard sometimes for Grammy. So be patient, but one day she came home from school when she was a junior in high school, and I was surrounded by a whole gob of books and magazines. And she said, "What are you doing, Grammy?" And I said, "Well, I have the program for the Christmas sorority meeting, and I'm looking for a Christmas story to tell."
Mhm.
And and she said, "Well, did you find one and all that stuff?" And I said, "No, I've used all the ones I like. I've already used, and I don't want to use it again." I said, "I'll swear, Sarah Beth, I think you could write me a better story than I'm finding." She said, "When do you have to have it?" And this was on Tuesday. And I said, "Thursday." She went out the door on a date. When she came home from the date, she handed me a paper. She said, "Here, Grammy, here's your story."
Is that? Oh my
I
goodness.
said, "Sir, I didn't mean for you to take time out on your date to do that. I was just talking." And I said, "That's all right. It only took me about 15 or 20 minutes."
Oh my.
And she had written a story, and the name of it was Christmas Baby. And the gist of the story, I can't tell you all of it, but she uses descriptive words.
Yeah.
But the gist of it was that one time before Christmas, a family, a mother and a father, and a little boy, a toddler, were seated in church waiting to see the Christmas program. And the little boy was standing on the pew between his parents, and the curtain opened, and there was the baby Jesus and Mary and Joseph, and the baby Jesus was a real baby. And we have that at our church
Yeah.
sometimes too. I'm sure you have too. And the little boy was so enthralled. He'd heard about the baby Jesus, but to see it and somebody alive and Mary and Joseph with him.
Yeah.
And so he leaned over and whispered to his mother, and he said, "Do you think God will send me a baby on my birthday?" His birthday was Christmas.
Yeah.
Well, and, the mother said, "Shh." And so in a few years, the mother had another child, and it was born on Christmas. Now that sounds unusual to you, but it's in a family that can happen because
Yeah.
Uncle Todd's birthday, my birthday, and Morris Jean's birthday are all on the same day. And she knew that, and that's probably why she thought she could get by with it.
Yeah.
But anyhow, the the baby was a girl, and the little boy considered her his gift from God for a birthday present. So he just really took her under his arm. He let her play with his boyfriends, always seeing that she was not hurt or that they didn't rough her up or something. but they were inseparable, and he just thought she was his.
Yeah.
And so they grew up, and he went off to college. And when he got to college, he met a girl that he was infatuated with. And one Christmas vacation, he brought the girl home to his home to meet his family. You can tell what was in the back of his mind. And so the little girl that was in high school then, or junior high school, decided she didn't like Ellen very well because she was going to take her brother away from her, you know. So, but before the vacation was over, she decided she did like her. And in a few years after they graduated, they got married. And that was the time when the sister was graduated from high school, was ready to go to college.
Yeah.
And, so the summer that they got married was the fall. She was to go to college, and she became sick. The sister did, and they found out that she had cancer. And he was devastated, just devastated, and nothing his wife could do would appease him or make him feel better. And she got to feeling bad about it too, you know, so bad because he was. And so, lo and behold, she died before Christmas. And the wife had worried so about him because he was feeling so badly about losing his sister. And she decided that his melancholy feelings were rubbing off on her. She didn't feel good. She was tired. She went to the doctor, and lo and behold, she found out she was pregnant in March. And the following December, the 25th, she had a baby. And she gave him back his birthday. Oh, that was the story Sarah Beth wrote for me to give to the sorority. And the girls, the sorority girls, women, old women like me, just loved it. Like me. And one time she wrote at Valentine's time about love. And I thought this was a little unusual for a teenager. She had been to the nursing home with me a number of times to see an old friend of ours that's 94 years old in the nursing home in Mooresville. And we had seen other patients too, of course, because we'd been there several times. So her story started out, and it said, described the old woman in the nursing home in a wheelchair with her frail hand on the rail in the hall, going up and down the hall. People passed her, spoke to her, and sometimes she nodded and smiled, and sometimes she didn't even acknowledge them. But the people who spoke to her didn't. And he was walking down the street thinking, what has happened to me? I used to have a home, a family, a job, and here I am now out on the street, bumming food, nothing that I ever had. What happened to me that I lost all of it? He went on down the street and it was cold, and all he had to warm him was the end of a cigarette. And he was smoking the cigarette, but when he smoked the cigarette and got a little warmer, he thought about all the good things that had happened in his life. He walked on down the street in an alley between two grocery stores, big brick buildings, and he died. But a smile was on his face because he was thinking about when he had been loved. And he needed love too. And then the third part of it was that she told about a woman, a very affluent person who had married against her parents' wishes. They didn't accept the husband and they didn't want the marriage. But the young couple moved out and everything was fine. She had a good job. He had a good job. And lo and behold, he died. And she lived in the big apartment that they had had before by herself.
Mhm.
And one evening she was working on her computer. And when she got through, she closed it down and she thought, now I must lock the doors. And so she did, went around and locked all the doors to be sure that everything was secure. And then she went to her bedroom and went to bed and covered up with satin sheets. But she couldn't sleep, just like many other nights that she had done this, but she couldn't sleep. She needed love too. And then her last paragraph was, we all need love, not just love between couples, males and females, not just love between parents, but love from the heart for each other. Everybody needs love. And that was her Valentine's story for her paper.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought that was tough. Oh, no, but I just now saw him walk through.
Well,
I love cats.
dogs too, with us. We've got a cat and a dog.
Oh.
And the other day, when I talked to Sarah Beth, I had the portable phone. I was sitting there in that chair when I talked to her, and as soon as I put the phone down, Brandy, she's a Sheltie, he jumped up on my lap, and I said, I've been talking to Beth. And her old ears pricked up, and her eyes got a sparkle, and I patted her a few times, and I said, Grammy's been talking to Beth. Where is Beth? That dog jumped down and ran to the window and looked down the street.
What you got here? Some
Those are pictures. I put some pictures out I thought you girls might like to see. But what happened to Chris? He couldn't come today.
He didn't hold of it.
Oh, well,
I know he was wanting to.
maybe he didn't want to come because Plainfield played Mooresville in football the other night and skunked them. No, I'll take it back. Mooresville made one touchdown. It was Beech Grove that on homecoming night, Plainfield had a score of 30 something and Beech Grove had 0. This was another one of her papers. The soapbox, that's what she is. She gets on the soapbox and she doesn't care who she stays on. Who are these pictures? Well, I'm going to sit around here so I can see with you. Oh, this is Aunt Nona's friends. This book belonged to Aunt Helen. See, it says Helen G. Calbert. Her middle name was Glendora, and Evelyn's middle name is Glendora. We family names. And I can pick out Aunt Nona in the picture. This is Aunt Nona. And this is her girlfriend, Tops. Her name was Mabel, but her nickname was Top. And I can't see that one. And I doubt if you girls can either, because this is old and old. It's faded, you know. And when Granddad found out for sure that Helen had tuberculosis, she lived not quite a year after that. All they needed to do for tuberculosis back in those days was fresh air and sunshine and the right kind of food. And so in the summertime, he rented a summer cottage on Lake Tippecanoe. And every week, different ones of her friends would use the link with her, so she wasn't up there by herself. And these are pictures from that. And this is Aunt Nona and her friends again. And this house is still on Main Street, the foot of the East Hill, on the north side of the street. There's a big house up on the top of the hill, and this is down. And that's where those pictures were taken. I don't know why they laid down to have the pictures. They have a lot of them. And a lot of pictures they did that. Let's see, I'm going to have to. That looked like Jerry, but being in this book, I think it was probably one of their boyfriends. And and Helen had a boyfriend named his last name was Maston, and some of his pictures are in here. Oh, no. This is more pictures of them on the lake. Lake Tippecanoe. And there's some in here that'll be more meaningful to you girls, I'm sure. That's it. No, no, look at the hat. This is in front of their house. See? Frank's house was made of cement block. Okay. Granddad's porch was cement block. There's 8 houses on South Center Street between Main Street and the end. Still have cement block. It was, yes. This is Helen and her Maston boyfriend. High school. And high school was then where the Old West School building. You remember the schools in Plainfield? Do you remember? Yes, I didn't think you would. But when my mother started teaching school, there was a big hill on Southeast Street, and there was a brick building on it with a big belfry up in the top. And Fred he was Rick's bad boy in the Calbert family. He could always think of something to do he shouldn't do. And he ran around with the Bly boys. You probably know the Bly family. Well, you didn't dare talk about a Calbert or a Bly back in those days, and you were talking about somebody that was related to him or a friend, you know. And so one day they decided that they didn't want to go to school. They didn't like school. They didn't want to go to school. And back in that day when the old brick building was on the top of the big hill, they rang the school bell. And it was real high on the building. So Fred and the Bly boys decided, and Frank, Todd, Fred and Todd and the Bly boys decided that if they couldn't ring the school bell, the kids wouldn't come to school and there wouldn't be any school. Because one night after college, they went to the old school building and they got into up in the belfry, but they couldn't get up as high as the belfry was. One of the Bly boys was kind of frail, and he was the youngest one, and he was the lightest one, so they decided that he could get up where that bell was, so they sent him up to the bell on sticks or little pieces of wood stuck out from a brick wall. Okay, so Ralph got up there and he got the bell down. He got over to the opening to come down with the bell on those little things sticking out of the wall, and he got scared. And they talked and talked, trying to talk him down out of the belfry with the bell, and they couldn't. And they had to call the fire department. And then it was volunteer. Uncle Frank volunteered on up in Mink as long as they lived almost. Anyhow, uh, they called the fire department. The firemen came and got Ralph out of the belfry, but not the bell. And the bell rang the next day. The firemen put it back on the cradle, and it rang the next day, and they had to go to school. Oh, Fred was something else. Like I said, he was Calbert's next bad boy. But he grew up to be the nicest, kindest person you could imagine. He'd take the shirt off of your back, but he never lost his humor. He was the one with the most humor involved. But one time when he decided, see, Grandpa Calbert, when he started the oil business, he had a huge, big, long wooden tank, round like a barrel, but the openings were up on the top of it. It's like a barrel laying down on frame with wheels, and a team of horses pulled it. And the opening for the barrel where he filled it was up on the top of the barrel. And the reason they came to Plainfield was because there was a switch of the Pennsylvania Railroad. There was a switch up here northeast of town, and he could put his oil tanks full of oil on there and leave them for a few days, So that was a very conducive thing to his business. And Fred had heard someplace that the fumes from gasoline could make you intoxicated. And Granddad ran that big tank wagon pulled by horses from here to Terre Haute. When tractors first came out, that's what caused him to start that business. Farmers didn't have time to take a horse and buggy into town after oil and grease and stuff that it took to keep a tractor going. So he took it to them. And his route was from here to Terre Haute and back, and it took him a week to do it because he took all the little country roads and sold to the farmers. Right in their barn lot and sold to the farmers. Frank even made soap that the farmers could wash that grease and stuff off of their hands with. I think it took the skin too, but at least it wouldn't. I can remember that they sold it in little buckets. I remember that. And so one time when Granddad came home, he always expected Frank to be in the barn lot and take care of the horses. And so Fred got big enough that Frank was trying to teach Fred how to do it too. And Fred found out that you could take that because he'd just come in off the road and that gasoline had slushed around in that tank and there were fumes. He'd take the top off the barrel, lean over the thing, and inhale the fumes and try to get drunk. Oh, gosh. Well, Frank did everything he could to keep him from doing that, but like I said, he was a little hellion. And then he decided, well, if he couldn't do that, he'd just go in the taverns and drink. So he decided to go in the taverns and drink beer. And Uncle Frank and Aunt Judy were married by that time. They lived in the weaning pen. And the yard of the weaning pen on Granddad's house was higher than the sidewalk and about a foot. And to drain the water from the lawn, he had a tile pipe that came out into the street. So one night when Frank was standing in the door of the weaning pen, he saw Fred come following down the street, not tracking right. So he thought, his parents didn't need to worry about that. He'd better do something about it. So Fred stopped and stuck his bottle in that tile pipe, went on in the house and went to bed. And after Uncle Frank was sure he was asleep and wouldn't see him, he went out of the weeding pen down the sidewalk and got the bottle out. And he put everything in it you could think of. Salt, pepper, vinegar, you name it, that was nasty. And he put in that thing. Fred came out the next day, got the bottle out of it, took one swig, never drank again in his life. And Uncle Fred was just, he was funny to his dying then. He was so, always so funny. But he loved, nobody had more love than Fred Calbert. He just loved everybody. This is this is the school building. Oh goodness, that's me when I was a baby. Oh. We lived uh, we lived on Wabash Street when I was born. We lived. It was the last house on the street then, on the east side of the street, and Uncle Frank lived in his house where well, and then when I was just a few months old, we moved up the street, and we were on the north side of Uncle Frank, but Robinson Street. And then before I started to school, we were lived right by. And that's when we lived in the second house after I was born. And Viva, I'm sure you've heard the family talk about Viva. She was a good friend of Toots's. I can't remember that name. Viva Griffin on the corner of Toots's. Viva Spear. I guess so. I and, and we didn't have babysitters then, but had we had babysitters, Viva would have been my babysitter. And I've got a picture of her standing by this thing. She was a friend of Helen's, and she ended up. Did you have her in school? Did she teach you in school? Viva? No. She did me. Hmm. She was a school teacher for a long time. She was a good teacher. She taught at Mooresville too for a while. She and Tooth both were good teachers. That's me when I was a little older. Books, we didn't have bassinets then. This is just a wooden frame with a clothes basket. Yeah, Boots made that in manual training class at school. Of course. Yeah. Oh, I can remember going after milk before we had pasteurized milk and a milkman. And I've got the little bucket as out. I'll show you when you go out. I remember hitching up the girl. I didn't do the hitching, somebody else did, but I did the riding. Brownie the pony in the pony cart with a little tin bucket going out in the country and go from the phone. Wow. Now there's Jenny and her mother, and I think that's Mona. Where's Calbert? I think most thought that Jenny was very photogenic because among the pictures that were found that he left were scads of pictures of Jenny, and she was pretty. She was beautiful. I've got a few on here too, but Granny. I don't know what that is, what it says. Oh, yeah, that tells who they are. Mhm. This is Lois Brown. That was Aunt Helen's very best friend. They both played the piano. play duets all over creation. This is Aunt Nona. Um, this is, can you see? Are there two people in that? Yes. Okay, that's Aunt Nona and Ruth Hatton. And there are two pictures in this one. Okay, that's Lois Brown and Helen. Okay. These two. And the bottom one is Ruth Hatton by herself. Those were friends of the girls back in those days. Bill's going to give us a light, I hope. Try. And I don't think that cord's long enough, honey. That's this is long enough. It should have hooked myself. Okay. Well, it's this one that's short. The cord on that. That's short. That cord has to stretch all the way down here because the plug in. Oh. Sorry, I have to pull it over here. Let's see. Well, this is some of this is at Helen. For some reason, I just just scanning to the computer sometime. You know, when you and then they come out like on a oh, that's wonderful. That's great. Let's see. Um, it's Anna, and that's Tops, and that's Helen. Tops. Well, Tops with Mabel Ellis. I heard your family talking about Helen. Well, that was their man, the trustee when the boys picked the mail out of the bell. Oh, I don't know where they came up with that one. And this is the girls again, but it's too little. I can't see them. What's that? Oh, that's somebody in the basement entrance, isn't it? That was the cottage on the Tippecanoe that they rented. Oh, and this is one of the girls that visited up there too. I I think I've written on here who they are. Can you read it? I can't read it. Geraldine and oh, wow. And you know, and stop and think about the physical characteristics. Think about Uncle Frank, how dark his hair was. Yeah. I mean, you probably don't remember except when it was gray, but sure, yeah. Real black eyes like ours. Yeah. Granddad, the genes come more of the physical genes like that come from a man, you know, and the sex is determined by the male. Yeah. And granddad, we got it. Wow. Oh, it was the party. And I can't see it well enough to tell you who all they are, and you probably wouldn't know anybody with the Calberts. This, thank goodness I've written a few of them down. That's my brother Bud, and that's Evelyn. That's when we lived by Uncle Frank. And that's me, and that's Gina. Oh my goodness. That's when Abby and I made the mud packs. And this is the house that we lived in. This is the front steps of it. And the same kids except two neighbor kids. And from the sisters, I think. Yeah, this is Rose and a neighbor's child, and and one of the little boys is Bud, and the other girl is Evelyn. Maybe. I've seen a picture of her. Now, who was it that asked me for a picture of Rose that they saw at the reunion? And Vicky took the picture, but it was the wrong one. So now we'll see it while we're looking through here. Okay. Tell me which one it is. You don't know who asked for it, do you? No. Well, I think it was Janet's daughter. Well, listen. But it was but you have an older sister? No. She has younger sisters, but not older. Okay. But this girl might have been her. Might have been Jana. Okay. But check this sister. Was who? Sister. It might have been Jana. That's Butch's daughter. Okay. She was looking at pictures. So okay. It could have been, well, it could have been her. Yeah. Let's see. That's tops. Mm-hmm. And that's Aunt Donna. That's out of the seven Calbert kids, Aunt Donna was the only one that had blue eyes. And that came from the Pennsylvania Dutch. All the rest of us have got dark eyes. And Aunt Donna's hair was lighter than anybody else. We might see in the pictures you've seen of Helen, her hair was dark. My son's hair was dark. We all got the Calvert eyes. Ryan looks just like GF did when he was young. He's got a grandpa. I've got a picture of grandpa. He's got a mustache. You cover up that mustache and it's Ryan. So don't tell me the genes don't come through. They do. They predominate. Oh, they had a granddad had a cousin that lived in Kentucky, and her name was Lily Purdue, and she had a daughter named Catherine Purdue, and she came here often to visit. And the Southerners always called each other Cousin Lily, Cousin Forrest, yeah, Cousin Felix. It was always that. And Aunt Nona and Boots are in that picture. And Catherine Purdue, that was Lily's cousin Lily's daughter, was Catherine Purdue, is in the one that's got a boy in it. Oh no, it's not. That's his wife, Geneva Edwards. So sure, that was quick. Little cut me over. Yeah. Look at the car. Yeah. I remember when cars first came out here in Indiana. They probably had them other places, but I can remember when they first came here, and most of them you crank. Yeah, yeah. To start them. And I can remember when at the Quick Oil Company, they had a little Ford, what did they call it then? We would call it a, and, but it was open like this, just like that. And Mick drove it. And he was so little that you couldn't see anybody behind the wheel. And people just thought the car was running away. But he'd scoot down on the seat, way down, and he could reach the pedals, and then like this, the steering wheel. And Nick, like I told you, was so Dutchy. And one day he was over at the plant. You know where the plant was behind Uncle Frank's house, across the churchyard. Well, they recently torn that building down. Okay, Nick was over there helping Uncle Frank do something, refine the oil or something, and he did something, and Frank said, "You better be careful when Grandpa comes. He'll just raise the dickens, and he'll get on a white elephant." That was one of the expressions. So they missed me. Pretty soon he was sitting out on the top of the fence, and Uncle Frank yelled and said, "Mink, what are you doing out there?" "Watching for the white elephant." Oh, no. Oh, this is Uncle Felix's granddaughter. They lived in Shelbyville, and Uncle Felix had Watson, Raymond, Irma, and a daughter. He had 4 kids, and Raymond worked for my grandfather, for most of his life, and that's why he was in Lincoln. This is Uncle Fred and Bud, and see what Uncle Fred's doing? Smoking. Trying to teach Bud to smoke and a baby. This is Uncle Fred and me, and this is me sitting on one of the cars that Grandpa Calbert owned. It was a Page. You probably don't even ever heard of a Page, but it was a Page automobile. Back in those days, they had Page, Pierce, Arrow. Those were the names of some of the cars. Chandler. And this was a Page. And so you can see the brick porch there. Oh, this is a high school class, and this is Boots. And there was the only one that didn't look like the cowboy. She had more of her mother like grandma. He looked like grandma. Saw me. This is Hawks kid above the high school. Of course, everything's fine. Now I got coffee or Sprite? Which would you like? I'll take Sprite. I'll take coffee, honey. I want to, because some of these I think are, that's Rose. See the hair ribbon? Yes. That's Abby. That's Aunt Nona. Aunt Helen. No, that's not Aunt Helen. I don't know who that is. It may be Catherine Purdue. That's Bob, Uncle Fred's only son, who was killed. He and his son at Greencastle. Did you know that? I don't remember that. Yeah, I mean, they were his wife had a sister who lived in Greencastle. Walter Ballard. Does that ring a bell? Yes. The name Walter Ballard was born and raised in Plainfield. This went to school here. Became the mayor of Greencastle. Then Jerry went to Greencastle. And did you know there's a street named after Jerry in Greencastle? No. Called Calbert Way. I didn't know that. Look that up. And I've never seen pictures of my mother that young. I mean, yeah, I bet that's Boots, Aunt Nona, Abby, and Rose. And I can't tell, is there a child there? You probably Diener. And these are some of the same. Oh, this is Aunt Nonna and Lois Brown, who was a friend of Helen's. And Helen took the picture, and this is tops.
Doesn't she look like, I mean, what, Granny? She look like what she does.
Uh-huh.
Oh, gosh.
Well, when she was a young girl, she went to Blakers and became a school teacher. And most young girls got married. But Granddad had a Hudson automobile, a big, yay long sedan. Aunt Nona could drive it. She could drive him wherever he wanted to go. She could do what, and it was hers when he didn't need it.
Yeah.
And she looked around at the boys in Plainfield around, and none of them could have afforded her life she had. And so she never got married. Of course, Helen died too young to get married. So, but this is the girls at the Tippecanoe again.